Welcome to Know Your Buildings, Building Assessment and How They Can Aid Preservation Planning. My name is Nicole Flynn. I am the Field Services Representative at the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance. I work with community projects and support preservation easements and grants programs. It's great to have you here as a participant in our virtual gatherings presented by the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance, the statewide membership-based historic preservation organization. This gathering is part of our ongoing and expanding work to help provide information to people like you who are caring for old homes, barns, and community landmarks. These virtual gatherings are possible thanks to our generous sponsors, Michael Petrovic Architects, Artistic Tile, Nobis Engineering, John Jordan Design, Martini Northern, and JRT Architect. We hope that you'll become a member if you're not already. Memberships help us save more community projects like yours, advocate for preservation at the state and local level, and expand the preservation toolbox so we can all encourage more preservation investment. We're providing lots of assistance in new and old ways, and even a little support from you can make a big difference. Today's discussion of building assessments as a preservation tool will include how they can guide repair, rehab, and restoration projects and support advocacy and fundraising. Panelists include experienced preservation project planner, Beverly Thomas from the Preservation Alliance, the program director, Mae Williams, architectural historian and historic preservation consultant, and architect and former Preservation Alliance board member, John Merkle. We're recording this session and we'll be posting it to our webinars page and our YouTube page for future reference. Please mute your microphones and use the chat feature to pose any questions or share comments. We'll do our best to address those questions during the presentation, but we'll also open it up at the end for questions and answers. So at this time, I'd like to pass it off to Beverly Thomas.
Okay, thank you, Nicole, and welcome everyone. My position at the Preservation Alliance includes administering the Condition Assessment Grant Program, so I'm very familiar with the way it works from our end. And John is actually on our review committee, so he's very familiar from our end as well, as he's a retired architect, so very familiar with these condition assessment reports. And Mae Williams is a part of our long list of consultants that help create these reports. So I think the way we're going to run the program, I was going to have people introduce themselves, but I think we have a few too many that would probably take half of the time. So I'm going to hold off on that. But we'd like to keep this informal, and please feel free to use your chat. And then if you would, Nicole's going to monitor the chat, but if you would like to follow up with some additional questions, when we call on you, you feel free to unmute yourself and introduce your building as briefly as possible. So then we can all learn about your particular situation, which often helps other participants. So I think at this point, I'll turn it over to Mae, and Mae and John are going to work on just sort of introducing what a building assessment is, the purpose, the different kinds. I know there are a lot of names to these reports and what they're used for and why they're helpful. So take it away, Mae and John.
Sure. So historic building assessments or building condition assessments or historic structures reports are all really complex reports that document the history, evolution, and character defining features of a building, as well as the existing condition of the building, and then use that context to identify the building's preservation needs and prioritize future preservation efforts for the building. These reports are usually written by consulting architects, engineers, preservation contractors, and or preservation consultants who have experience with historic buildings and with working with the Secretary of the Interior standards, which are the established preservation guidelines that have been established by the Park Service that we all in the US kind of work with all the time. So the reports are either written by one of those types of consultants or a combination of consultants, kind of depending on what the project is, what the building type is, what the use is. And the reports really create a solid roadmap for the building moving forward, creating, letting you know how to rehabilitate it, how to reuse it in a way that follows the industry standards. And following those standards is really important if you're seeking, in particular, if you're seeking grant funding to do preservation work on the building. We also wanted to talk a little bit about the purpose of the reports and how they're useful. As I just said, they can really help prioritize work. I know a lot of times I talk to people who are feeling really overwhelmed by an old building. They look at it and they say, oh, the paint's peeling. Our glass is about to fall out of the windows because the glazing is so messed up at this point. The floors are sagging, the roof is leaking. How do we even start? And I think a lot of times people just don't have any idea what to do because it's so overwhelming. I mean, I know I can honestly say I feel this about my own house sometimes. So the reports really compile all that information about the building's history and what has been done to the building in the past, how it's changed and evolved, and look at the existing condition of the building to help see, where you have physical problems, materials problems, but also perhaps code issues and things of that nature. And then they take all of those bits of data to create recommendations and cost estimates for suggested repairs. One of, I think, the useful things with assessments that we kind of overlook sometimes is that they also just compile all that information into one place so that you have a really thorough history of the building and understanding of the building that you can then share within your own community and also really use when applying for grants, seeking private gifts or launching capital campaigns. Assessments are really helpful to early in the planning process to really help provide that roadmap and help you figure out where to go with it.
I can add to a little bit to this.
Yeah.
These assessment reports also identify what is important to be retained and what is not important from a historical standpoint. It's very important that information be known, particularly if there's a change in use in the building, or in some cases, there is the need to determine whether it's rehabilitation, preservation, or restoration. There's different levels of things. The reports do deal with a financial impact of what is discovered, and a plan that needs to be put together that may have to be done in phases, and priorities are set so everyone knows going in what's going to be happening over the next 5 years. And it's a good tool because people change. From some of these are municipal, some of these are nonprofits, some of these are religious. There's some flexibility here.
Yeah, and with that, that's a great segue into the different kinds of reports. As John just said, what kind of report is appropriate for your project and what the emphasis of that report is really depending on how complex your building is, whether it's for a nonprofit or a municipality, and what the size of the organization is and their capacity to do work going forward. So there are several different types of reports that are all building assessments, and they all pretty much do the same thing, just in different degrees. So we have historic building assessments and building condition assessments with preservation guidelines. which are really appropriate for simple buildings with limited public use and no major change of use anticipated. Often I, as a preservation consultant, complete these types of studies with an architect or a timber framer or other preservation contractor. They can involve some discussion of life safety and building codes, but primarily tend to address issues of building maintenance and prioritize that maintenance going forward. Usually it's more towards the preservation contractor side of things when there's no anticipated change of use, and an architect and engineer when there's a presumed change of use or a major renovation or code compliance or structural concerns. Then we also have historic structures reports, which basically have the same kind of information, but also sometimes involve a bigger team and have more architecture or engineering technical studies, so more detail, and they're more in depth. Excuse me. And as I just said, how these are used and what kind of report is appropriate for you kind of depends on the project. I know John and I were talking yesterday too about how much these types of reports have changed over the past 20 or 30 years.
And while Mae's choking, I just want to add, I did a little study, little research on this last night, looking as far back as, I guess, the term historic structures report actually started in 1930. That was the very first one that was done. And throughout my research, these reports have changed names over the course of the decades, including now. People are calling them different things, but in general, a historic structures report is just a much bigger, beefier report, usually on bigger buildings and requiring more expertise than the condition assessments that we offer through our grant program. But I must say, I was listening to another webinar earlier this summer of an organization from a different state that were calling it a historic structures report, yet it was basically what we do, what we call a condition assessment. So I feel like ours are pretty thorough, but just not stepped up to a little bit more detail. And the historic structures reports are, usually for bigger buildings, usually, not always the case, but usually. You can do, if you have a fabulous house and you want to put it on the National Register and you want to do some really intense historic structures report, you're certainly able to do that. But also LChip differentiates these two types of reports as well. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, well, one thing that's good to say with that too is the Preservation Alliance has an outline of their building condition assessment and how it needs to be written to fulfill their grant program. The LChip has a slightly different outline for their building condition assessment and the historic structures report. And they're basically the same thing, just with different degrees of information supplied. And they have evolved a lot over time. I know a lot of the earlier the assessments that were done 20 or 30 years ago didn't go into the history to as great an extent as we do now. But I think kind of the emphasis in preservation has changed a little bit in terms of looking really at context, and just overall as a field, we've changed a little bit.
Well, and just to help you better understand your building, what you have, why a doorway is here when it wasn't in this 1910 picture, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, you're also able to do these with more detail now because they're done through the Preservation Alliance, which is not public. It's so it can use other resources that the Division of Historical Resources were not able to do that back in the days when when I first started working on them. They were administered and sponsored by the Division of Historical Resources, and that their scope was much more narrow.
And at the end of this, I'll talk about our grant program, but we just wanted to introduce what the report is first, and then I'll get into the details of our grant program for folks who are interested.
Yeah, and this is probably a good place to talk a little bit about what the report format is just generally, and what is included in different sections of the report. Any of these types of reports usually start out with a little bit of a summary talking about the purpose that the report has, and the methodology for the report, and a little summary of the recommendations. And I think this is actually a really important part of the report that we often don't really think about that much, because it talks about why your organization is really interested in this level of detail for the building. And it helps kind of fill in that historic gap. You know, when you look back at it 20 years later, it's useful to know what the thinking was at that time. The next section, the first big section really, is talking about the building history. So it's a written history of the construction, ownership, and use of the building, and how it's changed over time, why it's changed over time, and how that fits into a broader history. This helps us establish why the building is important. And you know, the history is usually compiled from the history that the organization has, whether it's a municipality or a nonprofit, what's at local and area historical societies, what's at the state archives, previous studies, written accounts, historic maps, all kinds of stuff. So it just pulls all this together like a national register or state register nomination would, and really pulls in that context. Then the next section of the report goes into the architectural description of the building. So this discusses the building's form and style, and setting, and the construction history. And all of this is used to determine those character defining features that John was talking about a little bit earlier. So it helps you figure out what important features of that what are the most important features of that building to tell the story of why it's important. So, you know, whether it's the general form and massing, the fenestration, so where the windows and door openings are, a layout of interior space. You know, if you have a meeting hall, having that big open space of the meeting hall is pretty important to maintain going forward. So this will help you when you get to the recommendations, because you know what are the most important parts of the building to keep going forward and to preserve going forward. Then the next section of the report, we go into the assessment of condition. So in a historic building assessment, this usually includes sketch drawings and floor plans of the building, whereas in historic structures report, it's measured drawings. I mean, if you have measured drawings, that's obviously better overall, but you go with what you have to an extent. And then there's a thorough inspection of the building for damage, structural problems, material deterioration, and things like that. So really a thorough look at the building to see what's wrong with the building. So kind of tearing it apart in a sense. And also looking at any issues of life safety or code compliance. So whether it's ADA accessible, those kinds of things. So once all this raw data has been gathered in these first sections of the report, we look at all that information and develop the recommendations. So you look at all that data, look at what the organization's goals are, and what the preservation goals are, and the usage goals, and figure out what the appropriate treatment is, whether it's restoration, rehabilitation, preservation, and then what are the most important things to get done quickly, and kind of prioritize things that way. So you know, these are the things we need to address immediately. These are things that need to be dealt with in the future, but might be a little further down the road. And how all of those things can be done in accordance with the Secretary of the Interior standards, with those overarching guidelines that are industry standard.
And one thing I think that's important about that phasing of the project is quite often project proponents find that what they thought was priority is not necessarily the priority. So that's one really good thing about these reports, help you set that preservation plan. And it's not always what you think it might be.
Right. Yeah, especially if you look at just the problems as they arise, you may think that the roof is the worst part, but then you may find that the foundation is shifting. So you may need to adjust those priorities. And that's why we like to look at the buildings holistically, looking at the entire thing from top to bottom, inside out, just so that we can identify all of those features and all of those issues.
And one of the things too, sometimes as a recommendation I'll make, or other people will make, is to have a specialist come in and get a second opinion of something. So, you know, I sometimes will recommend calling in a site civil engineer if, you know, you have this perennial issue of a wet basement, and having some more specialist ideas on that. But here's my holistic approach at the whole building.
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely part of it.
We have a question in the chat. Could you please provide a quick rundown of the preservation/rehabilitation options and explain which are the most or least intensive? This is from Andrew DePrato. Andrew, if you want to unmute yourself, we can talk about that with you.
Sure. Hello, Nicole.
Hello.
And Beverly, nice to put faces to
Hi,
names.
glad you could join us.
Glad to be here. So I know that there's 4 different paths and that I neglected to include the 4th one. And I've kind of read a little bit about each one, and there certainly seems to be some overlap. I'd like to hear from the experts kind of what the most popular is, what the most intensive is in terms of, you know, meeting that threshold, and what the intent of the 4 different options are, if you don't mind.
Mae, can you introduce for those who may not know the 4?
Yeah, so there is, let me see if I can remember all 4 off the top of my head. I usually, the most popular is rehabilitation. And then there's also restoration and preservation and
new construction.
Oh, new construction. That's why I don't think of that one. Thank you.
Reconstruction, yeah.
Yeah, the one that-
reconstruction.
Yeah.
Us people with old buildings don't think about as much. So those are the 4. Preservation is basically when you try to kind of put the bell jar over the building and keep everything intact as it is for continued use in the exact same way. And we don't really use it that often, but like museums use it a lot because it's just keeping everything as is. Restoration, we don't use as much either because that is choosing a specific date and time for your building. So if you have a building that, you know, a house that was built in 1808 and you decide that is the piece of history that we want the building to be, that would be bringing everything in the building back to 1808. And that's really hard to do because a lot of times you don't really know exactly what the building was in 1808. But that's another option. But rehabilitation allows for continued use of a building and allows it to change over time. So even if something has a continued use, you know, I'm looking at a Grange Hall that was a Grange Hall and is still going to be used as a Grange Hall, I might recommend rehabilitation because that will allow for the construction of a new accessible bathroom or accessible ramp on the building. I don't know if John has anything.
No, May, you've done it. No, you got it.
And I just want to say, for our grant program, I think every single one we've done since 2001 has been rehabilitation.
Yeah, and the nice part about that as well is that you can preserve different time periods and be satisfied, comfortable with that.
Yeah. Yeah, you can say, you know, the porch that was added on the building in 1920 is a really nice feature of the building and is important in its own right for talking about the colonial revival owners of the building and what they did in the building. If using that 1808 house example.
Okay. Any other questions at this time?
We have one other question from Sharon. Is there a list of people who are qualified to do these assessments or structural reports?
Yes, I will get into that. But before we get to that, John, do you want to pick up on how to use this report a little bit before I get into our grant program and the details of ours?
Well, how you would use it is you would make it be kind of like a long-term master plan that you'd want to be able, the recommendations and the priorities are going to be set in the report. And it's really up to develop a strategy as to how you're going to address them and pay for them. There are grants available. We also know that the capacity of once you know what needs to be done, the capacity of the aid organization or agency that has to deal with it very, very, very much. And often you need to be creative in how you finance these. And unfortunately, the reports don't address that in detail, but it's a master plan for the building's future.
Okay, thanks, John. So I guess if there are no further questions sort of about the report itself, I'll move on to what the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance offers with our assessment grant program. I know a bunch of you, participants in this session today, we've already talked to about possibly doing one. I think we actually have a few people here that have already had assessment on their building, and I'd like to ask you some questions on that after. But our grant program, as I said, has been running since 2001, I believe, and we've done like, I don't know, 77. We've helped fund 77 assessments. Ours is a one-to-one matching grant program. We grant anywhere from $1,000 to $4,500 for these reports. The reports, so that would be a $2,000 to $9,000 report. Majority of them do fall into that price range. Occasionally, if it's a very complicated building, the price might be a little more, or if there are multiple preservation professionals involved on the team, it might get above the 9,000, but usually it's within that range. And we do our grant program on a rolling basis. We have a whole packet of information on our website, nhpreservation.org, which has all the information you need about the guidelines, the policies. The application is in that packet. We do it on a revolving basis where rotating every month. We will accept by the second Tuesday of the month. If your application is in, we'll review it by the fourth Tuesday of that month. And you would get an answer probably within a week. And then in order to apply for these, you have to have a proposal from a preservation professional as part of the application. And we have a long list of consultants if you need help assigning a consultant to your project. And, you know, we have certain consultants that are better with churches, say, for example, others that, you know, specializes more in Grange halls. But certainly we can help you find someone that can work with you. And you may, you know, I often suggest talking to multiple consultants as well, just to make sure you're happy with them and you can work well with them. So that is a part of the application process. Then we review, once you are approved for an application, for a grant, I'll draft up the paperwork. You have a letter of agreement with the Preservation Alliance. And then once that is signed, the consultant can go out and do a site visit. And actually prior to the application process, we require that a New Hampshire Preservation Alliance field service person actually goes out to your building and talks to you. Because of COVID, we've been doing that quite often on the phone and not doing a site visit. But during regular times, we do require a site visit just to get an understanding of the project, the group, and to make sure that this assessment is really what you need at that point in time. And we're always here. Feel free to call if you have any questions about the process at any time along the way. So then the consultant will go out and do a site visit with you. And we highly encourage you to walk through the building with the consultant at that time, because you'll learn a lot just by the walkthrough. And then the consultant will write up a report, and the report can take, a lot, depending on how crazy it is in their schedule and LChip schedule, because there's usually a big push to get these done prior to LChip. But it could take anywhere from a couple months to a year to get these reports back, hopefully closer to a couple months. And then it goes through a review process. The consultant will do a draft. The draft has to come back to the Preservation Alliance Review Committee. And we quite often add some suggested edits or things are missing and fine tune the report a little bit. So it goes back and forth a couple of times. And then you'll have your finished document. And quite often, many grant programs will require one of these reports. Any grant request to LChip over $50,000, or at least that's what it has been. I don't know. They just made some changes this year. I do not think that has changed. So anything over 50,000, they are requiring you to have some type of a condition assessment. And unfortunately, timeline for this group here, if you're hoping to apply to LChip and you haven't yet, last time we as the Preservation Alliance can accept an application for an assessment for this LChip grant round is this February. So it only gives you till whatever the date is, February 9th, to get an application in for this year. And we would prefer that things don't get rushed. So if you can wait till next year, that would be really good. And it gives the opportunity for a field service visit, you to do the application process. The consultant won't be pushed. I know a lot of these consultants have a very busy schedule right now. But I'll just tell you, I just learned the LChip schedule. It was just published yesterday. And for those who haven't seen it yet, the grant round officially opens May 1st. Does everybody even know what LChip is? I should probably take a step back. Land and Community Heritage Investment Program, a state program that sponsors conservation and preservation projects. Wonderful program that usually has, up to, well, I think last year was 3-point-something million to distribute, and they distributed to conservation and preservation projects. So their grant round opens May 1st. Their letter of intent is due May 14th. And this is all on LChip's website, lchip.org. And this year, a new requirement, they are requiring a draft condition assessment with the letter of intent. And I confirmed with George yesterday. George Bourne is the historic resource person at LChip. the draft, the condition assessment does not have to be final. He said just draft, but it does have to be final by the due date, which is June 25th. So all LChip applications are due on June 25th with a final condition assessment. One thing they're doing this year, if you have your application in by June 11th, they'll do a technical review of your application for you, look it over, and give you some comments if you want to adjust things. So that's something new they're doing this year as well. So if you have any questions relating to LChip in the LChip process, you would direct those to George Bourne. I don't have his contact information in front of me, but it's on the LChip website. Anything related to the Preservation Alliance Assessment Grant Program, I would be happy to talk to you on the phone or shoot me an email, BT, my name's Beverly Thomas, so it's bt@nhpreservation.org. I'd be happy to help you. I think that's it for the process for the grant program. LChip does fund, so we fund from 1,000 to 4,500. LChip does fund the bigger historic structures report, ranging from a $10,000 and up report. Their grants start at 5,000, one-to-one match as well. So if you want to do the full HSR, I would suggest you talk to George at LChip and he can guide you through that process.
Can you say a little bit more about the range of costs for these reports?
Sure. Our grant program covers 1 to 4,500, which is usually about half. So the reports do range from, a very inexpensive report would be 2,000. We do very few of those. That would be a really simple, small building that maybe the project proponents have a lot of the background history, so there's not as much research that needs to be done. But I would say most of them are in the 5,000 to 9,000 range for a complete condition assessment with preservation guidelines.
Yeah, the more complex the building, the more you're leaning towards a change in use, the more likely you're going to need multiple people working on it, the more expensive it's going to be.
Yeah. And quite often we have architects even doing these now that are experienced with historic buildings, but we often pull in a preservation consultant to just look over the report to make sure all the preservation recommendations are in tune with the Secretary of Interior standards. So we have a lot of architects that are sort of joining the program. They're excited about historic buildings, but maybe don't quite have as much background. So the preservation consultant on the team is a big help. Did that answer your question, Maggie? Yeah. And I know, for instance, Andrew, I had a long discussion with Andrew from Pinkerton, who's on the call today, about the types of reports he had and does he need this full condition assessment? And I know he talked to George about this, but from our discussion, and I haven't been to the building, but it sounded like his town had actually done some very good detailed master planning of each particular building and had really good reports. So in their case, for Pinkerton Academy, maybe they only needed a preservation consultant to look at those existing reports to see if that would suffice. So there, we also have the small matching grant program for smaller grants that are $500, $1,000. And I was saying to Andrew, maybe we could just have a preservation consultant look over those existing reports with the preservation lens. So that's why it's important to have a site visit before you start this process, just to make sure you're going down the right path for your building and your project. Andrew, did you have anything to add to that?
No, not particularly. You got it pretty much covered there. We did have a master plan study completed in December. And so I just wanted to see if there was any way that we could apply the findings from that, obviously, to the condition assessment report.
Okay, thanks. And I know that there are a couple other folks participating today that I think have already had a condition assessment done. So if you would like to chime in here and let us know how that has led you, directed you with your project, how it has helped. I think Mount Vernon, are you on? Mount Vernon Town Hall, I know got one.
Yes, I am. This is Charlie Baker.
Hi.
And let me start out by saying that we are relatively new residents of Mount Vernon, moving here a little over 3 years ago. And still learning about a lot of the background in this whole preservation arena. And having looked at the reports, unfortunately, small town politics have somehow intervened, and with the delay in town meeting this year, I have no idea what is even doable in the first part of 2021. I know one of the thoughts that has been presented is to have your point, an architect come in and do another assessment plan. And I don't know if that's needed or not. And I'm getting conflicting information depending on which town leader I talk with.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, that happens. And this year was really hard because of COVID. And town meetings were delayed or were, Zoom meetings, and it just wasn't easy to communicate. And lots of things got held up. Lots of projects got pushed back. So yours is not totally unusual.
Yeah, our town meeting right now isn't scheduled until May.
Yeah, yeah. And is anything related to the town hall going to be discussed, or do you not even know that yet?
Supposedly the select board is preparing a warrant article to hire this architect planner to do another detailed report.
Okay.
And
Well,
unfortunately, I don't know the name of the person that has been identified.
that's okay. And we probably shouldn't say who it is anyway on this, but you know what? We should probably have a discussion about this, but this just goes with, there are complications to this. It's great that you have that existing report to show and to have some type of a rough estimate on costs. It would be interesting to see. I don't know. I would like to talk to, maybe we could have someone from our field service department here talk to you after, or even to maybe one of your select board to see why they're not using the existing report, or are they just looking for updated information, or what the reason?
And I know the Williams report, which is our expert assessment, was very instrumental in the Preservation Alliance's 7 to Save designation this year. So that was a key part of that. So it
That's
still
great.
has value.
Yeah, yeah. And that also points out the importance of updating these if need be, especially with costs. As we know, construction costs have gone up, I don't know, 20% or something this year. But it's good to have that. I don't know what the date of your assessment was, but it's good to have that sort of as a baseline and keep that. And the more information, the better you can tell the story, the better you can advocate for that building. But whether or not it needs to be a whole new full assessment, I don't know. I would need to get more information on that. But thanks for bringing that up. I mean, there's a lot of small town politics going on. And COVID has made it very difficult as well.
Yes, and with the loss of face-to-face meetings, it takes twice as long to get something accomplished.
Yeah.
Another thing to consider before you have a building assessment, if you do have maintenance plans or work that has been done on the building in the past, any of that history is really helpful for those contractors or consultants who will be coming in to do the building assessment, because there may be questions, especially when you have buildings that had insulation work or electrical work.
Yep.
All of those things are not visible with the naked eye. So having that history, if you do know it, is definitely a good thing to have in advance of that site visit.
Just to
In the
pick up on
case of
that-
Mount Vernon, Nicole, the infrastructural shortcomings of the town hall were detailed quite nicely in the Williams report. And to my knowledge, nothing has been done to address the issues that were pointed out in that report.
Yeah, and that's a tough one. I mean, we develop these reports, they have great information, and there's so many different reasons why sometimes the work doesn't get done. And I think with a municipality, it might be a little more challenging than if it were a smaller nonprofit who could direct the project. Are there any, let's see.
Mae, did you have something to add about that?
Oh, I was just going to say that the more information you can give to your consultant or consultant team at the offset of the project, the better. It makes it a lot easier for us, and the more open the communication is, the better, the more useful the report will be in the end for you. You know, we try our best to tailor everything to the specific building, the specific project, the specific organization. And the more you can give us, the better. That's all.
One last comment. In the, I know I'm going to insist that the Heritage Commission is part of this process, not just the select board.
That's key. That's great that you're doing that. One other example that I wanted to mention, I'm working with a small town up in northern New Hampshire that is doing a condition assessment through our grant program. And we got the draft back from the architect, and it had recommended adding this big addition to put all the new mechanicals in this building. But the price tag was huge, 1.6 or something. And the applicant and I had a discussion about this, and I said, is your town even going to, consider this? And she said, absolutely not. So it's important to talk to the consultant before they put a lot of time into the report, to sort of tell them what your intentions are, so they have some good background information. So this particular architect is going back and sort of rewriting the report in a way that would be sort of a phase 2, and that the numbers could be broken down. So they don't have to have this report saying 1.5 or nothing. They could phase the project to give a more likelihood of getting accepted by the community and getting paid for by the community. So really important to talk to the consultant with your intention, what you would like to do with this building before they actually put the pen to paper.
Beverly, we have a question from Sharon. Sharon, do you want to ask that question?
I'll speak that. Our property is a 37-acre farm with a 1759 house with a 1801 L attached to it, and 4 barns and a blacksmith shop.
Wow.
Yeah, it's an armful.
You are lucky.
Well, yes and no. Would we do each individual as a structural report, or go with a condition assessment for the entire property?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because
Yeah.
for the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance's assessment grant program, it's only for nonprofits and municipalities. We,
Mhm.
except for our barn assessment grant program. We do have a barn assessment grant program. So I'd be happy to talk to you about that.
Well, this is, the Historical Society owns this property.
Oh, okay.
R41, 3. So, and we have had, well, LChip assisted us in purchasing the property in 2009.
Okay.
And we have received another small grant from them to do some roof work last year. Other
So
than
which historical society is this?
Hinsdale,
Oh, okay.
down in the southwest corner.
Yep.
The house itself is, apart from electrical upgrade and water supply and a hot air furnace that heats part of it, is still in pretty much original condition. All the woodwork and plaster walls and everything
Mhm.
is in beautiful condition. We need to work on the 1801L because that has had some plaster issues and foundation issues.
Is this the, what is it called? Ebenezer something
Ebenezer
house?
Hinsdale, yeah, Colonel Ebenezer Hinsdale House.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And I feel like, didn't the Preservation Alliance do an assessment on that L in the past?
Yeah, a couple of years back, we
Yeah.
had just on the L, which
Oh, yeah,
cost us like $2,500.
yeah, yeah.
But the rest of the buildings definitely need some assessment so that we have some guidance on how to move forward. And
Right. It sounds like you do. Why don't we connect? Talk
Okay.
about this.
That's fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be great, Beverly.
Send me an
Yeah.
email.
When you're working with a building complex or a property that has multiple structures on it, if it's possible to afford to do a complete condition assessment of all of the buildings, that is a benefit because it gives you a chance to look at the priorities across the whole property instead of
Right.
just putting out fires here and there, and hopefully there's
Right.
no actual fires.
And that's where we are.
Yeah.
Putting
Yeah.
out fires.
Especially with institutions that have multiple property or multiple buildings, it can be very helpful for the maintenance to have those conditions assessment as a baseline, and then you set up a maintenance
Plan.
maintenance plan, and that becomes like a living document that you put in. We painted this building with this paint on this day, and then we did the plumbing on this one, and you just have that as a living record of all of the projects that you've done, so you can kind of see where you've worked and where the next phase should go.
Okay.
Okay, I think we have a few more minutes for
I'll
a
be in
couple
touch.
questions. Go ahead.
I'll be in touch with you. And last fall, we had a member's son do a 360-degree virtual tour of the house and property. So I can send you that link, and then you'll have a real clear picture of what we have.
Great.
Yeah.
Any
So
other
if
last
go
minute
ahead,
questions?
Beverly.
Okay, take it away, Nicole.
Right. If no one else has any other questions, we'll be sending a follow-up email with some of the resources that we have, and it'll include my email address, of course, as well as Beverly Thomas and some other information for you. So let me just pull up my script again here. Thank you so much for participating in today's session. I especially want to thank the panelists for your wisdom and sharing your experiences with us. We'll be sending out some follow-up links with additional information, as well as an evaluation that will help us plan future programs so that they are useful to you. Please help keep the Preservation Alliance healthy by making a donation or renewing your membership. 80% of our funding comes from people and groups like yours. Our work, Preservation Alliance and yours, is even more important than ever as a respite, connection to community, and longevity, and is fuel for economic recovery. Our next session in this Community Preservation Project series will be Thursday, February 11th at noon, and that is Getting to Yes, Proven Strategies for Community Action with Maggie Steer. To sign up for this session or any of our other events, please check our events calendar on our website, nhpreservation.org. We want to wish you well on your projects, and most of all, we want to wish your family and you good health.